Worlds, and it was the only book I read at the time that on one read I really got excited and could hear sort of sound. It was such a visual piece, what H.G. Wells wrote, and not a sort of a typical science fiction shoot 'em up, knock 'em down sort of story. So it had a lot of depth to it as well.
Were there other contenders, but possibly that you were going to use as your material?
Well, there were fantastic stories that I was reading, but each one got eliminated usually either because they were too long, too literate, too wordy, and whereas H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds was very succinct. It wasn't a particularly long book, about 150 pages. And what I discovered, which is perhaps why it was easy for me to create in terms of the layout of how I wanted to write my score, was that H.G. didn't write his story as a book to start with. It was an episodic adventure for a magazine called Pearson's, and the whole idea was that he'd write a chapter and leave you as the reader sort of as a cliffhanger wanting to go back and, of course, buy the next edition of the magazine. And it proved so popular in the magazine that his publishers then asked him, can you please put it all together as a novel? So the opening chapter of his story is called The Eve of the War, and the piece you just played is my first composition. It's sort of like an opening, an overture to something
pending. It lends itself, doesn't it, into various segments, doesn't it? That's the great thing about the book and indeed the musical.
Well, I certainly had a fantastic template because most of the compositions are titled after the chapters from his book.
I'm with you. So once you decided this was the book for you, to try and do this musical piece too, how did you get everybody together? Because you have some great luminaries, haven't you? Richard Burton, David Essex, etc., all to come together on the album. How did that work?
Well, with the exception of Richard, because his was a pure acting role, everybody else really came from the world of music, even though they all had to do some acting as well within the recording. I demoed every piece so that there was no presumption on my part that even though, say, David Essex is a good example, who I'd been producing for years, touring with him, he was a good mate. I couldn't just presume I could call him up and say, Dave, come on down to the session and be this artilleryman on my project called The War of the Worlds. And I demoed every piece, singing, acting sections, and it was the best way that I could present what I was trying to do to each of these artists.
But of course you actually had, in the end, a checklist of great luminaries from the 70s, didn't you? Judy Covington, Phil Lynott was there as well.
Indeed.
I mean, it's like a snapshot, isn't it, of great rock stars from the 70s on that album.
Yeah, I was so fortunate, and it all came really from being introduced to them if I didn't know them, or in the case of David, Julie I was also working with, because I met her in the same way that I met David. They were both in a West End musical called Godspell, and they were doing sessions for me before we actually formally worked on The War of the Worlds, and I was in a band called the Godspell Band, which was the touring band in the local sort of clubs around London, and as their keyboardist. Not that I had anything to do with Godspell, but as sort of a mate, I did the arrangements, played keyboards, and they were in it doing the vocals. So it came about from that, or Phil was a fantastic example of a mutual contact, and he was keen to do something different in his own career. So this role of a parson who goes mad thinking the Martians are the devil, and only he with his cross could save the world, he was up for that. He was a delight to work with.
Another great thing, apart from the music on the album, was the artwork, wasn't it? It was very famous for the artwork you had on there. How did you commission that?
I knew an art director named John Pash, and John came in and wanted to get involved with The War of the Worlds, and he did two things. He designed the logo, and he also introduced us to painters that were specialists either in science fiction machinery or others that were landscape specialists from the Victorian period. And with his briefing, and my dad and I, who were partners on The War of the Worlds, we presented our script, the music recording as it existed at that point, and they went away, and they sort of did demos and would come back with drawings and sketches, and between them all, they came up with the paintings that wound up not only in the album, but a whole bunch of others that over time have been released, and all of our of those paintings and sketches have now been the basis for the 100 minutes or so of CGI animation that is in our show.
Sure, of course. And where are the original paintings? Are they still in existence?
All but one of them. I have them at my home, all framed. Unfortunately, one of them never came back from a science fiction exhibition that I loaned all of them to, and unfortunately, to this day, I never knew what happened to that one.
Were you surprised by the success of the album back in the late 70s? Because it was the first of its kind, really, wasn't it?
I was stunned by the remarkable success it had and continues to have. And as a young composer, I had the opportunity to do something that I'd never done before in my career. That was the real challenge for me, and I knew that I may never have another opportunity to do it. So much so, as a bit of background, is that the record company that I was with, who backed me, I probably, when I did my deal with them, I didn't know, firstly, how long it was going to take to make, but also how much it was going to cost. So they backed me to everything that I asked for, which was £70,000 for this double album.
Was that the total cost of producing the album?
No, it cost $240,000.
That was a lot of money, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was my whole life savings. The difference between what CBS, which was the label at the time, backed me for, and what it actually cost. So there was a lot of passion involved in the whole thing.
And did you put all your money into that as well?
That's what I'm saying. The difference between $70,000 and $240,000 was my life savings.
So it was a big gamble for you then.
Yes, it was. But again, I came back to a critical moment with my family, in fact, at the time, talking about this. I said, look, we've come to the end of the CBS money. Either I abandon ship and wave the white flag, or I carry on, but it's going to go straight into the depths of everything that I have in my savings, the house perhaps. And they said, look, you're never going to get another chance, perhaps, to do anything like this again. Go for it.
Sure, and thankfully, and of course, because you heard it, it's fantastic, isn't it? It was a great success.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I'm looking back now some 32 years, and I can see what resonance it had with audiences and critics all around the world, but I really didn't know it at the time. The truth is that it was the height of the punk revolution. Disco is king of the dance floor, and here I am trying to, through a musical interpretation, create what became a continuous play, no cuts on either of the double album, with a link of a storyteller recounting his story of survival in the 1890s of this Martian invasion. So, the band used to, would come in disbelief and saying that you're putting your money into this? And so much so to the point where actually at the start of the production, I said, look, guys, this is becoming a bit risky for me. Would you like to take a risk with me, and I'll offer a royalty in lieu of you taking fees, because that represented obviously a good chunk of the total cost. So they went away into a room, and the only condition I actually sort of established with them was that they all had to agree one way or the other. And they went into this room, came back, I don't know, half an hour or so later, and they were well divided between them. Some wanted to go for it, and others didn't want to take the risk. So ultimately, the majority was like by one. Had to pay them the fees.
Wow, what a great story. Well, I'll tell you, one of the great singles from that album was Justin Hayward and Forever Autumn. So we play that now and come back and talk about the stage show.
Sure, of course. Thank you.